colleagues and friends in Saudi Arabia are fighting for or against the brave Saudi women human rights defenders who are in prison right now for fighting against male guardianship and even the right to drive, which is now legal. So thank you for coming, and I'd like to start by welcoming the panelists. Safa Al-khamri, filmmaker and journalist, Dr. Hala Al-Dosari, a researcher and Saudi women's rights activist, Mishra-Newbery from Women's March Global, and I'm Christina Stockwood from the Gulf Center for Human Rights. And do we have Umayma? We have a Saudi woman human rights defender, Umayma Al-Najjar, on the screen via online link up. Hi, Umayma, can you hear us?
Hello, everyone. Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you. So first we are going to hear from Hala.
All right, thank you very much, Christina, and everyone who coordinated the event, and thank you for attending. So over the last few years, I want to talk a little bit about the women human rights activists. They have mobilized their community. They've made extensive outreach to get an endorsement of community figures in the media, people across different networks of human rights in the region and internationally, to get the recognition of the issues facing women in Saudi Arabia, particularly the extensive restrictions in women autonomy and mobility. And hence the campaigning that they've done to lift the women driving ban, and the campaigning to endorse abolishing the male guardianship system in Saudi Arabia. And those names have been really all over the news, and they're very much recognized inside Saudi Arabia and outside as the leading figures in women's rights movements. Amin Al-Juaid, the last woman who spoke in the video, has actually reached out to the women activists, and they provided her with legal representation, protection, job, while she was on the run from her abusive families when the state protection system failed to help her. Of course, Amina now is in a shelter in Riyadh, and I'm not sure what happened in her case without the support of those women activists. So since summer of 2017, when Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman came to power, we have witnessed an increased repression against any independent voices, not necessarily the women. It started with a wave of arrest that targeted anyone who is independently criticizing any reform or advocating for any reform that is not in line with the official government line. In September 2017, we witnessed a massive, basically, crackdown on intellectuals, writers, moderate Islamic figures, community figures from different wavelengths. And then in November, you get another wave of arrests targeting people in the media, the tycoons basically of business, even members of the ruling family. It seems to be like a political purge. And then in starting May last year, we have seen gradual roundup of women activists that started with 7 people, 3 women and 4 men, who supported the women movement. It was really unprecedented in Saudi Arabia because we have seen how the government basically blended the whole crackdown as an attempt to get to agents against the state, basically accusing the women and the men who supported them of treason, which is the worst case scenario. So the women have been smeared in international media and the print media. They have been tried basically by media. Influential figures in the government have been articles against the women. There is a huge social media campaign against them. It was a horrific thing to witness. It was definitely unprecedented. And then, of course, we've learned after Khashoggi's murder in October that the family were finally allowed to visit the women. We've learned about symptoms of torture that was visible on the women, the uncontrollable shaking, inability to stand or to move or to speak fluently. And when the family pressured the women to speak. We've learned horrible accounts of torture, including electrocution, waterboarding, flogging and beating. We've also learned of sexual abuse, which was really something that we haven't anticipated. All the torture has been carried out by members of the cybersecurity department. It was a new department headed by a top advisor of the Crown Prince. His name is Saud Al-Qahtani. And this man has witnessed sessions of torture. The details of torture has been documented by different human rights organizations. It is horrific because even though the women have given statements to relevant authorities within Saudi Arabia, the National Human Rights Commission and the General Prosecution, we've learned that nothing came out of those investigations. In fact, beginning of March, the General Prosecution moved to refer women to trials. And not only that, they've actually said that all those detained are enjoying their full rights. The fact that they have not been allowed any legal representation, kept in isolation for 4 months before being allowed any kinds of visitation. No recognition of the torture claims, no investigation, due process was never been followed in any of the cases. And even, the information on their trials, which is going to take place tomorrow, has not been made, none of those women knew about the trials except one of them, which is weird. Even the families were not informed about the trial, again, without any kinds of legal representation. Just to finish a little bit with the idea of guardianship, and this is something that is very much, the government denies that there is any kinds of restrictions on women, and that the restriction is only on travel and marriage, which is not true. As you've seen from many of the cases, the women who campaigned to abolish the male guardianship system has asked for more than abolishing basically the travel or marriage restrictions. They've asked for women not to be reported by their guardians as absent from homes or disobedient, because that really is the main control that men have over women making any kinds of choices against their guardians. Those two cases in which women languish in prisons or hunted by the government, whether inside when they run away from abusive homes, whether inside or outside the state, are still in effect. In addition to obtaining a life-saving abortion, obtaining a scholarship, being able to stay in a job against the will of the guardian. The guardian has the power basically to go and ask for a woman to be terminated from her job. So there are all manifestations basically of the guardianship, despite the fact that the government recognized the campaign and issued a decree, a royal decree, to mandate that all different or relevant authorities need to review their basically procedures or regulations. But yet to date, we did not see any kinds of review of those restrictions against women. And women maintain, actually it's more harder now to, it's more difficult for women to mobilize the community or to engage in any kind of movement outside of the state because of what happened to the women activists. And I'm sure one of the women who's going to speak, Amani, will talk more about the culture of repression and the impact it has on any independent voices within Saudi Arabia. So I'm going to stop now.
Okay, thank you, Hala. And in reference to some of the descriptions of torture, including sexual abuse of the women activists in prison, we do have a report by the Gulf Center for Human Rights by the door if you would like to take one of that, and it goes into more detail into the current situation and history of as well of torture in detention. I think we're going to turn now to Hanaa Al-Najjar, a Saudi blogger in exile who wasn't able to join us today in person, but we have her by live link. Umayma.
Hello everyone. I'm here to speak about the importance of international pressure on America, because even though in the United Nations, the latest criticism in which 36 countries have all agreed that Saudi Arabia needs to work on its human rights, implementing all the international treaties that they've signed. But throughout the phase of all those human rights violations that are against the women in Saudi Arabia or against journalists, America has been the only country that was supportive of the Saudi regime. Unfortunately, those women who are at the moment are being charged with terrorism, and the laws of the anti-terror laws or anti-cybercrime laws, they're to be actually used in the court against them. It means they could be facing anywhere from 5 years to 10 to death penalty. And if the international community does not take an action at the moment, anytime soon, we're expecting another mass execution to happen in the very near future. Not so long ago, we had a mass execution back in 2016, in which included some of the dissidents and activists, and it was done secretly just to avoid the international outrage. So the Saudi government is fully aware that doing such a mass execution could provoke the international community. If it is done very late, it will be, if it's done very, very secretly, so like they've done it before, it could be very late to save those women's lives. What the American community can do, I believe, is whether business owners or those who work in the entertainment industry can boycott Saudi Arabia, pressure the politicians who are being supported through media to stop selling weapons to Saudi Arabia and demand the release of those activists, female activists in particular, unconditionally and immediately before it is too late. As you all know, even though I get a lot of arguments, last time I spoke in the European Parliament, a lot of the politicians or journalists claim that Saudi Arabia is very strong. There are bilateral agreements, economic agreements between the West or America and Saudi Arabia. But on the other hand, Saudi Arabia is very dependent on the American economy exchange. All the weapons that they're using, all the empowerment and the validation that they're getting, it's all coming from America. If you look at throughout, if the Americans have started campaigns against the Saudi regime, it could help very much. And we've seen successful cases like the case of Hanaa. She was facing death penalty, but because of the international pressure, the death penalty was dropped. Badam is another case in which she was being flagged publicly, and because of the international outrage, the flagging was stopped. So it could help very well the American community, and that includes journalists and people who work in the entertainment industry, or even business owners and investors or politicians to pressure the Saudi government, especially because they have the closest ties with the Saudi government. The Saudi governments have always been friends with the Americans. So it could actually be more influential than the European Union. Yeah.
Thank you, Umama. And I want to point out that due to the hard work of the coalition that we belong to free Saudi women human rights defenders, particularly the International Service for Human Rights, 36 UN member states, including all of the European Union member states, signed on to this resolution calling for the Saudi women human rights defenders to be freed and for a proper and thorough investigation into the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. And we welcome all those member states led by Iceland who signed that statement, and we would like to point out that the deadline for sign-on is March 22nd for other member states that might like to join on to that statement and add some more UN pressure. In addition, one of the asks of this coalition and this event is to follow up on what Umaima said, is to call on countries and businesses to stop selling arms to Saudi Arabia and other technology, for example, that can be used against human rights defenders. So I think now we're going to turn to a recorded video by another Saudi woman human rights defender in exile, Amani Al-Wahdi. And I'd like to just point out that you will notice that none of the panelists, whether on video or in person, are actually Saudi women inside the country. And I think it's pretty clear why that is, because they're not able to freely join us either by traveling here from Saudi Arabia or by participating online due to the risks to themselves and their families. So are we ready with...
Sorry, can we just go to, I don't have them yet. Sorry. So perhaps if you go to something else now.
Okay. So we will come back to Amani's video in a minute. Safa, are you ready? Sure. Okay, so we will turn to Safa Al-Ahmad, and maybe you can follow up on what I was just saying about arms deals as well. And
Yes. I mean, there's a lot of commonalities about what needs to be pushed from here. But first, I would like to inform everybody that is in this room that you are now potential terrorists in the eyes of the Saudi government based on the anti-terrorism law. And this was a law, I'm not joking, you are. And this is a law that was enacted in 2014. And so this was when King Abdullah was still alive and king, and this is pre-MBS. And so I will read you a little bit of how crazy this law is. It says, the ministry's guidance states that terrorism would be committed by anyone attending conferences, seminars, or meetings inside or outside the kingdom, targeting the security of society or sowing discord in society, as well as those inciting or making countries, committees, or international organizations antagonistic to the kingdom. So, as you can see, the anti-terrorism laws are quite wide. They include everything and everyone. I think they were designed to scare everybody into silence, inside or outside the country, so everybody is their purview. And this is one, I think, of the scariest things that set a bad precedent for what the next king, King Salman and MBS, were able to do afterwards. So King Abdullah's era really ushered in a lot of the legal arguments for giving precedence to what they are doing today. And one of the things very few people know about is in 2011, Saudi Arabia did actually join in the uprisings in the rest of the region. And it was one of those rare moments in Saudi Arabia, and as Hala was saying, the unprecedented. There were so many unprecedented things that happened in that time. And one of them was one of the longest political protests in Saudi Arabia in 2011. That was in the east. But at the same time, there were protests by women in Breda as well. And so you had this moment where you had women and men in the eastern province, you had women in Breda in the central region, and they were all protesting against political prisoners and the demand for the release of political prisoners. And that was quite a unique moment in the history of Saudi Arabia and political protest there, because there was a unifying moment where everybody, regardless of the sectarian issues, which became sectarian issues later, where everybody wanted this moment to be something to mean real structural reform in Saudi Arabia, where they were simply demanding the release of political prisoners that have been languishing in prison for years without trial or a just trial, or even after they finished their period in prison, they were still not being released. And so I think bringing it up to what is happening now, the focus on the weapons, I think, at least for me, is not enough. I think that the fact that countries stop selling weapons to Saudi Arabia is simply symbolic, because Saudi Arabia can go to a lot of other countries to buy the weapons. For me, if a country had the balls, sorry for being if they ever had the courage to do so, there is more of a symbolic, moralistic judgment on Saudi Arabia more than anything realistic about the impact of not selling weapons to Saudi Arabia. If the United States of America wants to continue to claim that they have any moral standing or any claim on human rights, although now we have Trump, so I'm not good. then that is simply a symbolic move. But they can't even do that. I am very skeptical even of the boycotts of business. I mean, yes, after Jamal Khashoggi's horrendous murder, some companies did withdraw, but in reality, they all came back. I mean, SoftBank has invested with a lot of, like, I think it's about $100 billion of Saudi direct investment into Silicon Valley. So now when you use Slack, you'll have to thank Saudi Arabia. When you use Uber, you thank Saudi Arabia. And so there is major investments in some of the vital things we use in our phone, right? But nobody wants to inconvenience themselves in that way. So I'm very skeptical about the realities of businesses actually boycotting Saudi Arabia in any way close to apartheid South Africa or something like that. But it is a moral thing that we're all walking around claiming that we have. To me, it goes towards a more intrinsic relationship of what are, as people, what is our relationship with Saudi Arabia and how we, as people, boycott. I have very little faith in our governments, and I think they have acted quite irresponsibly, and I don't hold them to any moral standards. So sorry, I'm going to be really skeptical about what we, as people outside, can actually do in these things. I think there should be pressure on them, but I don't buy that they would have any interest in preserving human rights inside Saudi Arabia. And so, to me, the question is, how do we do something more concrete on a human level and not on a governmental level? And I'll be happy for any government to prove me wrong on that one. But even Sweden, who is a very feminist government, tiptoed straight out of their criticism of Saudi Arabia because they still want to sell weapons to Saudi Arabia. And so there's a lot of hypocrisy about how we deal with Saudi Arabia. There's a lot of, and I feel like there's a lot of, there are two extremes when you cover Saudi Arabia. You either love it and you're getting a lot of PR money and you're defending it to the death, and there are people like Trump who do this, or the other extreme of you find everything that Saudi Arabia does abhorrent and disgusting, and it shows the backwardness of Saudi Arabia. And I think both extremes are not useful in fully understanding the context of how Saudi Arabia operates, or understanding the people of Saudi Arabia, or considering Saudi Arabia only the royal family, and that there is nothing in between those things. And I find that quite problematic in how we talk about Saudi Arabia. And we're not talking enough about class. I'm sure Hala would have talked more about the privilege of women within a specific class that are already in power versus women who are disenfranchised, or of a class where they don't have the access before, when we weren't allowed to drive, who had access to a driver, who could afford to get a driver, whose father would allow her to have a driver and bring him in and pay the money. And so all of these things are much more complex than the Saudi government is oppressing women. I think there's a structural issue in Saudi Arabia about them oppressing everyone. And it's equal opportunity oppression at the surface. It is a theocracy. They do use whatever is convenient to them to oppress everybody below them. And so it's a class system of the royal family, the privileged class, and then you go down. So, for example, the workers, the maids, the drivers, all of those are on the bottom of that totem pole of who has power. And we must acknowledge these things as we talk about what is happening inside Saudi Arabia and who has power and who doesn't. We're just talking about, now we have a female ambassador. Mm-hmm. Is that representative of a progressive Saudi government? I think not. I don't think she represents me. I mean, there was this terrible, terrible book, and it started with, "In a land ruled by kings, I am a princess." And I was like, in a land ruled by kings, I am so definitely not a princess. And you get a very different treatment depending on who you are and what's your privilege within Saudi Arabia. So yes, you can't talk blanket about who is oppressed and who isn't. You have to talk about power dynamics inside Saudi Arabia and who has the privilege and access to that power. And I'll stop there. We'll have more interesting conversation with the Q&A.
Okay. Thank you. I mean, I think we're looking at some small victories, and we're looking at promoting the positive. So we want to thank Iceland and other countries for the UN resolution, statement, and call for a resolution at the next next session. And we want to thank Germany for standing strong on arms deals and saying, no, we're going to cut it off.
Unlike Canada.
Yes, as I was just going to say, at the same time as we were going to say, Canada, get off the fence and cut these arms deals now.
And the feminist Trudeau.
Yes.
But, you know, it is, one of our victories has been the case of Weaam. She predates the current crackdown on women human rights defenders arrested in Khatif in 2015, and when the public prosecutor announced last August that she would be facing the death penalty, there was a huge outcry, and finally, just recently, they announced no, they wouldn't seek the death penalty. That is a victory, but she still might face 20 years in prison for peacefully protesting. And her husband and her other co-defendants who are men and didn't get the same uproar because she would be the first woman put to death for peacefully protesting. These men are still facing the death penalty. So every victory is tainted by the reality of the just rampant human rights abuses. We have other women in prison like Hanaa Al-khamri, who is serving a 6-year sentence. People for their online activism for doing nothing more than calling for equal rights for women or the right to drive. And we keep asking the question, if women are now allowed to drive in Saudi Arabia, why are there at least 17 women and men rights defenders in prison right now for calling for the right to drive in Saudi Arabia? That's a big question.
And that goes across the board and not just about the driving. You can't criticize the war in Yemen, for example. They will extradite you from Kuwait to Saudi Arabia if you had done that. Nabil Rajab is in prison for a tweet on his stance against the war in Yemen. So it is quite an astonishing array of oppressions that
extending, as you say, to Bahrain.
Yeah.
Obviously, the impunity of the killing of Khashoggi in Turkey, which is another shocking violation. I think now we're ready to hear from Amani Al-Almaty, who's...
Hello, my name is Amani Al-Ahmadi. I'm here today to talk about the current war on free speech in Saudi Arabia today. Whether you're living inside of Saudi Arabia or abroad, it's safe to say that most people are afraid to death for speaking their own mind. With the continuous crackdown on Saudi activists, journalists, and free thinkers, and with the latest gruesome murder against Jamal Khashoggi, more and more Saudis are reluctant and scared to death for expressing their opinions or even fighting for their freedom and their rights. We are faced with a challenging time in Saudi Arabia, where the great majority is forced into a fake sense of patriotism and silenced into obedience, while the other minority who are living abroad have to fend and fight for the greater majority back home who are still living in this situation. In times like this, we've seen people who are too afraid to even follow certain people or share certain posts online, so they don't see that they even share that mentality. Many influencers have renewed their sense of loyalty to the country and expressed their support to MBS and the regime, just to avoid getting on that list or being targeted as someone that might be influencing either disobedience or encouraging people to express criticizing thoughts against the government. We've seen famous accounts that even have gone online and have been encouraging people, and especially social influencers, to encourage Saudis to renew their loyalty to the government, or else they will be targeted. Such actions we've seen are just simply the surface of the situation. The Saudi government has launched a program called Nafida to help Saudi citizens report missing family members if they are suspected to be detained or anything, that then this system will help them. They're even normalizing this crackdown to be something accepted, to be just another part of society, just a part of living here in this country. In times like this, we're forced to demand actually other countries to bring about change. When the citizens of our own country are helpless in this situation, we need global interference. We need action, and we need it quickly. Thank you.
Okay, thank you to Amani. Do we have Umaima still available for participating in question and answers? Yeah, okay. I think I had some questions that I wanted to discuss with the panelists before we open up the
Yes.
floor to questions.
Yes.
Hi.
Yes, I would actually like to answer just one. I was hearing about one of the ladies on the panel saying that it might not be very helpful if the Saudi government would not, if they were to boycott Saudi Arabia. If you have been watching the news recently, Saudi Arabia have been desperately reaching out to the West, trying to make Saudi Arabia look more westernized. The MBS have been putting that himself in front of, the creator of Facebook, some very famous American investors, and he's been doing some publicity for what he calls the 2030 vision, in which he wants to modernize Saudi Arabia and makes it more Western, more like Dubai. So if the Saudi Arabian government is actually very needy at the moment of the West. So I believe, especially in this period, if the West is, if the Americans are to take, a stance against the Saudi government, plus the entire European Union and other countries like Australia and Canada, they would definitely listen. I don't think it would be useless. I think it would actually help a lot, especially in this particular period in which Saudi trying to look more Western and more modern. So I think I hate to disagree, but I think it could actually help. And if you see like the latest concerts in which they called Andrea Bocelli, or they called Mariah to come and reform, they're obviously trying to win the West. So I believe having a position against Saudi Arabia, having a stance against Saudi Arabia would definitely cause an impact.
Thank you, Maima. Thank you very much.
Can you hear us? Can you hear us? Can you hear us, Maima?
Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
I cannot hear you.
Oh, can you message? Okay. I think we want to look at, not just what governments and businesses can do, and we can welcome when people refuse to go and play golf tournaments or concerts in Saudi Arabia, and we can criticize Mariah Carey when she chooses to do so. But what we've been doing all together collectively, the organizations who put this event together, CIVICUS and the International Service for Human Rights, Women's March Global, Equality Now, the Gulf Center for Human Rights, and other partners, is looking at how can we work together collectively as NGOs. And last year we really rapidly came together as a coalition. So I'm going to turn it over to Mishra-Newbery to talk a little bit more about the NGO and coalition support for just a moment before I ask one more question.
So I think it's important to recognize that there is an international coalition of organizations that is working directly in regards to Saudi Arabia and advocacy when it comes to male guardianship, when it comes to stop funding war, when it comes to freeing and demanding unconditional and immediate release of Saudi activists. The coalition, as Christina has mentioned, is comprised of the International Service for Human Rights, the Americans for Democracy and Human Rights in Bahrain, CIVICUS, WHRD MENA, Equality Now, and I think Gulf Center for Human Rights. And we work together, really bringing our strengths to the table to participate in advocacy on multiple levels. The joint letter to the United Nations that was put forward by our coalition was, and the advocacy that we've been able to do behind closed doors has resulted in the United Nations holding Saudi Arabia more accountable. We need to see more happen on that front, and so while we welcome the news from the 36 member states, we are going to be working to really make sure that the United Nations continues to hold Saudi Arabia accountable, which has now been sitting on the Human Rights Council for the past 3 years. In addition to this, we have a petition that has close to 250,000 signatures. If you all can take one of these postcards on your way out, there's a QR code and a link to a website, so you can add your name. Please sign and share this. This is addressed directly to the United Nations to hold Saudi Arabia accountable and demand the immediate and unconditional release of activists. So we're hoping to get to 250,000 signatures. That's a lot of people. We need every single person to sign and share this. And in addition to this, as Safa talked about, we have addressed also, as part of the work of the coalition, ending male guardianship and the importance of linking all of these different facets together. We can't look at what's happening to Saudi activists and Saudi women who are experiencing male guardianship in silos. We can't look at what's happening in Yemen as a separate silo. All of these things are completely interconnected. We need to remember that the United States sold $4.5 trillion of arms to Saudi Arabia. The United Kingdom has sold $9.2 billion to arms in Saudi Arabia. There are countries that are incredibly complicit in the continued oppression of Saudi women, and it is the work of the coalition to address all of these different systemic ways that the Saudi kingdom continues to oppress and silence Saudi women.
Thank you. And I wanted to also thank the co-sponsors of this event, the Urgent Action Fund for Women Human Rights Defenders, the Global Fund for Women, and Scholars at Risk. Urgent Action Fund also funded a graphic novel just to try to get a little more attention to the Saudi women human rights defenders. If you want to take one by the door there and share their stories, please. We really want to put a human face to these women. I think because we're running a little behind, or there were delays getting in, maybe we'll move to some questions now from the floor and then just sum up at the end with any final comments. So I would like to thank Lyndall so much for all your hard work, and also the UN Correspondents Association for organizing and hosting this event in the room. Thank you very much. And Melanie's gonna hand out the
My question is for Hala and Safa. My name is Hanaa Al-khamri from Lebanon Files. What do you expect from the UN, and is there anything in particular you would like the Secretary General to do?
Definitely to go on from a resolution, from a statement to resolution, the 36 member states statement should be translated into action. I do believe that it works to have a political will behind any kinds of statement or a call for action. We believe that this is the time to apply constraints on a leader who is very much gone in an unprecedented repressive way, not only a destabilizing way to the society of Saudi Arabia, to the very much valuable work of civil society that has been restricted from before, but the applying constraints on Mohammed bin Salman or on the leadership of such leadership, not necessarily Mohammed bin Salman. We're talking about the Sisi in Egypt, we're talking about Syria, we're talking about so many different leaders who have adopted repression as a way to control the masses. To use the mechanisms of the UN in ways to constrain those leaders is significant, not only for the stability of those emerging civil societies in the region at times of great suffering, but also for the stability of the region at large. You get to see and sensitize the calls, the calls that sensitizes the masses for escalation of the situation with Iran, basically calling for an open war. And this is something, if happens, it's going to be throwing the whole region into chaos more than it is in now. So I do believe that applying constraints is important with whatever means that the UN has, and as well with the idea that different states can collaborate exactly under the leadership of Iceland in the same manner as what happens with the statement. We believe that the collective action of member states can bring a change. We've seen that in the delayed recognition of the Saudi government of the responsibility for killing the journalist Jamal Khashoggi in the consulate. So we do believe that international pressure yields results, but only when collectively done. We do expect that Mohammed bin Salman can stay in power for another 50 years. This is the time to apply constraints and to prevent this kind of outrageous behavior in the region and inside the country.
To follow up on that, I think the role of the United States in this should not be underestimated, because they are the ones who set the tone, really, for the political will for anything seriously to be done about this. I think the Trump administration have been, well, I mean, I don't even know what the word is for how supportive they were of this government, and even when Congress enacted the Magnitsky Act, they completely ignored it. They did not even respond to it after the 120 days had passed, and there was absolutely no repercussions to it whatsoever. So even in the most powerful of states, where there is an institution that should be calling to question that fundamental relationship between them, there hasn't been. And even following it up with the realities of what's happening in Yemen, and the inability of the UN to even do anything of any serious consequence about stopping the war in Yemen, even though it is now the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. That is not enough. And so, just commenting on what Imaima was saying, we are not disagreeing. I think what I was trying to say is I'm skeptical that businesses and governments left alone with that in October, when things were really, really hot about Jamal Khashoggi, had quietly and very quietly come back. Everybody was trying to get a meeting with the MBS in Davos, and so to me, I'm skeptical of, if left to their own devices, they won't have any moral compunction of not having a relationship with Saudi Arabia because they think it's financially viable to them. And so since now we're in New York, this is the place to question American involvement in all of this, and how much pressure should be put on the United States of America in their relationship with the Saudis.
Yeah, definitely. And we can thank groups like Endeavor Talent Agency for handing back $400 million in investment funds and saying no thank you. So
yeah, let's
go to the movies
hope
Guild
others
to
do it.
read. Yeah. Are there any other questions from the floor? In the back, left there.
Sorry, I'm behind the camera.
And please, if you could let us know where you're from.
Yeah, hi, James Lionel, independent journalist. Thanks so much for the briefing today. I'm interested in women asylum seekers from Saudi Arabia, like Umaima Rafa. It's been big in the news recently. I'm interested in getting numbers on this. The UN counts asylum seekers as a whole, doesn't distinguish between men and women. Do you guys have the numbers on women? Also, there has been a significant increase in asylum seekers in recent years, but the biggest increase was 2015 to 2016. That's before MBS came to power. Another interesting detail is that the increase in asylum seekers has been across the board in the Gulf. It hasn't just been Saudi Arabia. Qatar and the UAE, for example, have seen a significant increase. And one could easily argue that the UAE is a better place to be a woman than Saudi Arabia. So perhaps if you could just put a little bit more texture and nuance on those numbers.
I don't have a number, actually. There is no transparency in these issues because at times not everyone who decides to leave the country is seeking necessarily an asylum. Sometimes they leave the country and relocate under different types of visa. So it's very difficult to give an exact figure. But we know because of the what we've seen is the tip of the iceberg from the cases that has been very much went viral online, that this is a continuous and ongoing problem, very much a manifestation of the overwhelming control of women's lives inside Saudi Arabia. And we've seen another woman who has fled the UAE as well and has voiced in a video her need for help. So I would say the manifestation of the guardianship system very much exists in different Arabic countries or in countries ruled by the Sharia law, not only in Saudi Arabia, but it is most pervasive in Saudi Arabia. In the UAE, you get the same issue of travel, of marriage, of the basic things where the obedience clauses in the law, for instance. Access to economic independence as well is one of the challenges for women when they live under a guardianship, the control of the guardians. So yes, you can be. It depends again, as Safa has mentioned previously. It depends on the class or the support of your family. If you come from an educated family who is willing to provide you with choices, will not obstruct your ways in gaining education, experience, access to public resources, or marriage, you're not going to be harmed. It's only in situations where women guardians are not approving of their choices that they can actually affect those choices. So in reality, many of the women who escape are actually the lucky ones because they were able to get their passport and the permission somehow made through app. But then the other women who didn't are the women who are running away inside Saudi Arabia, and we have a good number of women who run away inside Saudi Arabia from their country, from their families. And unfortunately, in the cases of those women, they are running away not only from their families but from the law as well. The minute they get reported as absent from homes, they're treated as criminals. They have to be seized and placed in prisons, regardless of their age or ability to live independently. Exactly like Amin al-Ju'aid, who escaped her father. She's an adult, but she couldn't choose where to live. And this is one of the asks of the guardianship system. The marriage and divorce constraints on women under the family law, the existing family law, is extensive. So that again applies to all the women in different Arab Gulf states, and not only to the women who are native, but also to the women who are foreigners. The New York Times have reported on a woman who is an American woman married to a Saudi, but because of the laws of the guardianship, she can't leave Saudi Arabia after her divorce without her daughter. Although in Islamic Sharia, she's still a fit person for her to gain custody for the child, but unfortunately, because of the regulation of the guardian, the child cannot travel or be in the custody of the mother outside of Saudi Arabia. So these are the issues that drive women in general, not only in Saudi, but in the Arab Gulf states or in the Arab countries in general, to seek the support basically outside or to mobilize around those issues, but with the high risk of being targeted for those kinds of activities, like what happened with the women activists inside Saudi Arabia. So do you want to comment on that?
You know more about the kid.
If I may just add that in the recent years after the Arabic Spring, the Saudi Arabian government actively exported refugees from Bahrain to the West, to America, and because they have participated in the civil war in Bahrain. They're also exporting refugees from Yemen and causing instability in the neighboring countries. So the recent Saudi regime, the politicians in Saudi Arabia have been causing instability in the Middle East and Gulf area in general. The sanctions on Qatar, for example, have also caused tensions between Gulf countries and continuous threats. So it's the exporting of refugees that's been happening in the past years is because generally also the way the current Saudi government handles the situation in the Middle East.
Thank you. Thanks. Okay, do we have any other questions or comments?
Hello. Oh wow, that's loud. My name's Ian Graham, and I'm from an organization called Scholars at Risk. Scholars at Risk is an international network of universities and colleges dedicated to defending scholars, but also everybody's right to think, question, and share ideas. We're deeply concerned for Professor Hatun Al-Fassi and her colleagues, and we're concerned about the impact that their arrests have had on freedom of expression and the higher ed sector, both in Saudi Arabia and regionally. I was wondering if the panel could maybe speak to some of our concerns about the higher ed sector, and I'd also like to take the moment to let everybody know that in part as a response to this, we've launched an online petition on our website where people can call on Saudi authorities for the immediate release of Hatun Al-Fassi. So I'll turn it over to the panelists.
Thank you. Hala. So Hatun, as an academic, she was one of the rare, basically, professors who have engaged the community in their work. It's very unusual for academics to be engaged in public affairs. But again, the other women activists, Youssed is a retired professor from King Saud University, but also heavily engaged in initiatives in the community, as well as Iman Al-Nafjan, who was the main coordinator who had done a lot of outreach and endorsement for October 26th driving campaign, a very well-known blogger and writer. She was a professor of linguistics as well. So the minute you step outside of your technocratic, basically, profession, the minute you stop being basically a vessel for transferring knowledge to the students and try to apply those knowledge to advance the community in general, you become threatened and targeted. So this is where the line is drawn for many of the professors inside Saudi Arabia, whether men or women. They're working, of course, the case of Matthew Hedges in the UAE is a classic example of how when you try to reach information or to conduct field studies of somewhat political nature, you might be targeted viciously by charges of treason. Really put the whole academic freedom question on the front for any university who's trying to invest inside those countries or is trying to build charters in different Arab countries, which harms the whole Vision 2030, which harms the development and the progression, basically, of higher education in the region. It sends a very negative message that professors who have been known, like Hatun Al-Fassi, for several decades, who have won awards, who have been recognized by international boards, are being treated in such ways and then kept in solitary confinement for months without access to legal representation and possibly facing serious consequences just for voicing an opinion to a reporter. So this is something that is very negative, and of course it does set a difficult and dangerous trend that no matter how educated, how informed you are, you can never be part of decision making, of influencing a decision or an opinion in your own country. This is very dangerous. It really makes the academia not a way to improve, actually more of an inaccessible way to improve your community or country.
And it shows the range of people caught up in the crackdown. There were young female bloggers, there were activists who've been known to be criticizing the lack of driving, professors respected, all backgrounds, businessmen.
Oh, I think it's symbolic of, it's deliberate, right? The message is we are going to allow top-down decision-making, right? So we're going to allow women to drive, but let's not mistake that for giving you power, that it wasn't your campaigning work that has led to this decision. And so I think there is a clear definition of I control all the power, and you have to learn the lesson of you must not speak or have an opinion or campaign, because I think that was the thought process of how do we allow women to drive, but also not give the illusion of power, the ability to change your own society at the same time. So they all got phone calls before of not speaking, and they were all threatened. And so I think it's a really, they're quite clearly saying we're going to reform our style, and everybody else needs to shut the fuck up. Mm-hmm. And if you don't, you're going to be accused of treason. You're going to be accused of all these things if you do not comply. And so the price is so high right now It's unbelievably high. So even if you're a woman with supportive male guardian, if we're going to play that game, the male guardian, even if he's supportive, is going to worry, right? Not just about you, but about his own family, his own income, his own livelihood. And so I think they've done this brilliant scare campaign where they're not only impacting you, they're impacting everybody else around you. And so that nobody can mistake who has actual power.
The families are banned from travel. So children of prisoners who were rounded up, children as young as 2 years are banned from travel. So all the children of Jan are banned from travel. All the family of Jan, including her siblings who are studying in a nearby another country's university, are banned from travel. So they've actually put the lives of those around the women in hold, so that as a way to ensure that they're not gonna react.
So you don't miss the message.
They're not gonna react to their arrests or torture or whatever atrocities happen.
It's very, you said before, Safa, the whole appearance of class and what women in one class, have access to versus women in another class, and the painting by the Saudi government and MBS of this progressive, campaign that women have, and Vogue Arabia also pitching in their wonderful, cover image.
A princess.
Yes, of a princess having the right cut. So on one hand we have this subliminal messaging, and the heads of, MBS was just in India as well, meeting with Narendra Modi. We have all of these governments kowtowing to him, but then on the other hand, we have this incredible level of silence and oppression.
I mean, the Saudi government is gaslighting its people in phenomenal ways. And so before we had the right to drive, they kept insisting that there is no law banning women from driving. It is society that's decided not to allow women to drive. That society is the one who's leading the way. And then one day we'll all wake up and there is a law that we can all suddenly drive. And it's just like, pick one. I think they're deliberately.
I mean, they're exposing themselves at the same time, because when the women took the initiative to show that the society is not necessarily resistant to the driving, and they took the initiative to drive, they actually exposed this whole argument that it is the society but not the political will that goes against it, because none of the women were stopped by the society when they tried to drive. They were stopped by the police and by the authorities. So I think the whole idea
and accused of terrorism, because both Lujain
the
and
use of terrorism exactly is something that exposes how the system deals with the demands of the public, the demands of the citizen. It's not responsive, it's not respective, definitely it's not safe for people to engage with. So this is a system that needs to be reformed or changed. So I think, it's...
I don't know if it's capable of reforming.
Well, at least it cannot be living in a silo. It has to live within international norms and diplomatic means. And
that they've
those
signed
are
up
the
to.
things. Those are the things that we should use to constrain whatever erratic behavior, because we are vulnerable. I mean, even if we say like MBS has gone and someone else came, who believes in good governance and respect for the people. I mean, what kind of guarantees, what kinds of balances and checks are in the system that would protect us from something that would go in the same, erratic way as it happened with MBS, or with other countries as well. I mean, if the other countries try to basically export their repressive laws, as what happened with Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, or if other countries like the UAE try to lobby with different authoritarian governments in order to block, certain foreign policies, or to dominate basically the region under a swipe basically of repression. That is not a guarantee. You need to have an internal guarantees against the system repression or against the absolute use of power. And this is, I think, where we are, what we need to do.
I mean, and it's, and you remember when a school in Mecca, a girls' school was burned down in Mecca, I think 2005, and there was this whole uproar, and the king had committed, I think, like millions of dollars to reforming the justice system, and there was resistance even from internally from it, because
I think
there
the
was
justice system reform has this is one of the major problems. So reforms are being sold as materialistic reforms rather than reforms in principles.
Yes.
So for instance, let's have more technology, let's have more counting, let's have measurable performance indicators, key performance indicators, rather than let's have a different views of governance, let's have a different engagement with our public, let's have more participation, let's have more safe spaces, people safely expressing their opinions and engaging in applying those kinds of balances and checks. So we did not witness any kinds of reforms on principles. We are witnessing just more of a use of technology to basically modernize
brought to you by Google and Apple.
Exactly.
I mean, but it is more complicated than that. I think of how there are different conversations that we need to have. There is an internal Saudi conversation that needs to be had, and then there is the role of the international community and how they relate to Saudi Arabia. And there are fundamentally different ways of looking at how to engage the Saudi government and the difficulties of engaging with Saudi government in this way. Because I mean, with Jamal Khashoggi's case, you saw the internal. You must all swear allegiance to MBS again, and you must be supportive. And there's no space for having that critical thought inside Saudi Arabia. Yeah. But then, okay, everybody was really interested in what was happening, and then everything quiets down from the international community. It's like you have to have follow-up. You have to have teeth to these resolutions. But you must have commitment in this.
I would also add though that the international community, the amount of press that Khashoggi's murder received versus the amount of press that women human rights defenders and Saudi activists have received has paled in comparison.
Yes, or Yemen.
Yes, and Yemen. Where is the press on women in Saudi Arabia, on male guardianship, in Yemen? Where is the press? We see, the press has left, literally, in this room. Why do we not have the continued conversations behind what is happening to women in Saudi Arabia? Why is it that it takes one, brutal murder of Jamal Khashoggi to be able to have these conversations when this has been going on for a really long time?
Yeah. Can I also say there's a complication of having to talk about, maybe this is too for here, but talking about Orientalism, talking about Islamophobia, talking about things that really are complicated within Western media about how they perceive us. And also how we talk about these things in a complicated, complex way that show that diversity within us of how do we talk about these things. And it's not as easy. A journalist brutally murdered is a really easy, not complex thing to stand by. Right? It's clear, it's black and white, there's no complexities in it. Yemen is very complex because, you brought in Iran and it's a proxy war and who do you support and everybody's bad. And so it's very hard to talk about it except starving babies, which is also to me really, really problematic about how do you cover these topics. And so I think the reason why media have shied away from actually digging into this more is because Jamal was an easy story to cover and dig into because it's just like so gruesome, but also it's black and white.
Okay, I think we have another question over here. Please, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Melissa Upreti, and I'm a mandate holder with the United Nations, the Human Rights Council. I'm a member of the UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women in Law and in Practice. So I just wanted to, and I came in late, so I'm sorry if you've already discussed this, but on the issue of international pressure and the question of how much international attention the situation has gotten, I just want to point out that sometimes what happens is we see certain things and then we don't, right? So as far as the working group is concerned, we have sent 5 communications to the Saudi government over the last couple of years, actually, as the situation has evolved and gotten worse, and also very recently. And it's not just our mandate, but at least a dozen mandates have signed on. And this is important because it really reflects that this is not just about one issue, but multiple issues. So for example, we've looked at it as an issue of discrimination, but there are mandate holders on freedom of expression, on violence against women, freedom of peaceful assembly, freedom of religion, etc., who have all expressed concern and tried to get answers from the Saudi government. Now, what's been very frustrating is that the government has completely ignored the communications. Saudi Arabia is a member of the Human Rights Council, and yet they refuse to be held accountable in any way. But these communications, the communications themselves are private communications, they're just sent to the governments, but the fact that they've been sent is public. And I feel like there is an opportunity to sort of use that information, the fact that these communications have been sent, and to say that there is an international outcry, there is outrage, and you have all these mandates, you have mandate holders who are responsible for assessing compliance with human rights and international norms, saying that this situation is untenable and unacceptable and has to be accounted for. So to the extent that it can be integrated in some of the advocacy that is done, or when journalists write about the issue, maybe sort of referencing that fact, when advocates are talking about the issue at the local level, whether you talk about it from the point of view of discrimination or freedom of religion or whatever it is, I feel like there are many entry points. And I wanted to point this out today because, like I said, we've sent 5. And we will continue to send communications as long as this situation continues. But if these are not utilized by people in different fields, journalists, activists, and others, and they're not really going to amount to much. But I just want to also say that you shouldn't think that there isn't international pressure. We have been trying to, some of us at least have in our own capacities been trying to exert pressure. Now the question is, how do we amplify that? And how do we make a point with it, a larger point with it, that there has to be accountability? I also just want to add that, I was talking to a number of women human rights defenders today from Egypt, actually, and from different countries in the region, and they were also pointing out how what's happening in one country is not obviously an isolated thing, but there's this connection, right? So when one country gets away with it, another is emboldened, and another is emboldened. So in that sense, I feel like as we talk about one, we also have to talk about the others and really think about, what can we do? But I think lifting up all of them and talking about the situation is really important. So just wanted to share that information.
Thank you. Yes, and when you mentioned Egypt, there's sort of a leader in showing the bad way to the other countries. Yes, Omama.
Yeah. We were actually discussing the same issue in Geneva, and we spoke with the reporter from United Nations. And the Saudi government do respond to the communication. They actually accepted the communication, but for the reporters to go and carry an investigation, they need a formal invitation. And so the Saudis don't have the job, and they're not inviting the reporters, so the reporters would not be able to come to the country. And this is what we're actually working on at the moment, and I believe pushing for an independent UN, for example, a UN personnel to go all the way to Saudi to investigate, to carry on an independent investigation. And we see this already happening in Turkey. We want this to happen again in Saudi Arabia. And I think it could help if we keep on pressuring, especially after since all the 36 countries have all pushed Saudi Arabia to accept not only communication but also to send invitations. So we should carry on with that. Consistency and persistence, this is what we need to do. After all, if you've seen the case of Jamal Khashoggi is a very good example of how the persistence of the journalists actually forced the Saudi government to confess the killing. Otherwise, they would have been, they would have never confessed. So it just needs a bit of resistance, just like the case of Jamal Khashoggi.
Thank you. I think it's important to emphasize that the spread of anti-terrorism laws across the whole region has led to the terrible persecution of human rights defenders who probably were freer before the so-called Arab Spring in 2011, when one by one we've seen all of our friends and colleagues arrested from each country. Some countries, they're in the Emirates. We have no more colleagues to rely on.
But can I also say, again, say the role of the United States in this, in the forever terrorism war that they've conducted, and how that has directly led to these countries getting a lot more money. And I talk specifically, like, for example, Yemen, Ali Saleh before 2012, they all played on what the United States wanted to hear about who is a terrorist, and putting deliberately, and this is proven, that they call their enemies internally as terrorists, so then they get money and support from the United States, and then the United States doesn't talk about who you're putting in prison, who you're killing, who you're disappearing, who you're executing, because all of it falls under terrorism. And so again, the United States plays a huge role in making it so much easier for us to be oppressed. legally.
So we can't forget that tomorrow, Wednesday, March the 13th, we know that at least 9 of the women's rights defenders are going to be in front of the Specialized Criminal Court, which was set up to try terrorists, and is being used instead to imprison and persecute.
Yeah, but they
human
clearly
rights
had written in the law who they consider a terrorist. Us. I mean, it's designed to accuse anyone of anything inside the country. And so this is the thing. There was no pushback when that law was put in, because King Abdullah at his time was seen as a reformer as
Actually,
well.
it has revised to be more aggressive, actually.
Yes, they've changed it. Actually,
They've just changed it. And,
the quote I read to you was from a UN report, published June 6, 2018, about the Human Rights Council. So that was a special rapporteur that was in Saudi Arabia that had written this report, and it specifically talks about and warning about the conflation of human rights activists and terrorism. So the UN has gone and they have written the reports. And this is, sorry to go on about this, but I am very skeptical because all of the stuff the UN does has no teeth.
So I think it helps as well, even if it hasn't gone to any kind of prison. I think it is helpful. The idea that there is, I think we need as well to put our own weight behind things, so that I'm very grateful for the work that the UN different groups are doing around it. I've seen the European Union as well statements, the resolutions, there are different ones, not only one. So I'm grateful for that, and I do believe that there is a missing link, that the work needs to be amplified in the media, in the civil society, in the community. But unfortunately, that is not happening because of the repression against journalists inside the region. But I do believe that this work helps, and we need to have more resistance. We're here for the long run. It's not like something that will end now. So I do believe that we need to keep up whatever good that is happening, even if it doesn't yield immediately. It will eventually lead to something. It's a learning experience. I understand this kind of repression has been very much unprecedented in Saudi Arabia, which has already been repressive already. But this level of aggression has not been witnessed before, especially what happened to the women activists. It's really a landmark case of how the government would go against any kinds of moral or legal obligations to basically put someone to shame, an activist to shame. So I think that is, I need to be produced by different UN groups or by the special rapporteurs. So we need to have this kind of engagement, reaching out. I know the government has more resources in order to deliver the narrative, to deliver a certain set of messages, of public messaging, than the very much fragmented, oppressed and vulnerable civil society. So I urge anyone who has the power to reach out to the civil society, to reach out, to amplify the voices of those people, not necessarily for them to say something, but to inform them of the mechanisms of the work that has been done already, so that they can work on their own community. It is important, and we shouldn't stop doing it just because there is no response from the Saudi regime. I do expect that there will never be a response from the Saudi regime. These things are very much, and if they respond, they will just deny any accounts of torture or lack of due process. So yeah, I think it helps as well, and I get to see how the media, I myself has been provided a chance, an opportunity to be heard through the Washington Post. The fellowship of Jamal Khashoggi has been established by the Washington Post after his killing in order to give people from the region a platform to speak. I know the risks involved, of course, but I feel like this is a very significant opportunity for people to speak and to show basically that there is something that can be done to counter this terrorism, basically. And I do feel that this kind of unique and innovative ways to amplify the work that we're doing, maybe we need to evaluate what we're doing as different groups. What is missing so that work could be effective, could really reach actions, could mobilize the masses? Are we missing the connection with different agents? Are we missing informing different groups of what we're doing? So I believe that people need to connect more and to support each other this is something that is a learning process, and we all have to engage in.
Thank you. Yeah, it's good to see when that you got the fellowship, or Safa, you've won awards for your films as well, Dr. Hatun Al-Fasi, that Saudi women are getting this recognition. It's really helpful. We have a question from Guadalupe.
Thanks. Just a comment here. Yes, my name is Guadalupe. I work for Amnesty International, and I'm from Latin America. I live in London. But maybe just to follow on a bit of that hopeful note that you're doing, because I do think, there's still a lot to do, and the enemy's everywhere. But I do feel that on the plight of Saudi women, I think there is advancement. You're all sitting here, we're all screaming about it, and I don't think we were able to do that 20 years ago. Nobody was doing it. So I am hopeful, that we are advancing, and let's continue sort of finding those different places when we can all sort of get together and sort of raise awareness, fight for it, and go for it. And you saw it this morning. You were attacked this morning very clearly in that other panel that you were in, Safa, and which was on the one hand but it was very clear how the gloves are off, and the whole sort of room noticed what was going on, which I'm not so sure would have happened 20 years ago. Just on a hopeful note. Yeah. Thanks.
Yes. Are there any final questions before we wrap up? No? Okay. Another hopeful note I would also say is, Loujain Al-Hathloul has been nominated for a Nobel Prize. It's kind of a wonderful thing to think that this kind of recognition is quite widespread now. But still, obviously, because we are here sitting at this panel, there's a lot of work to do. And I think we also wanted to call on the UN Secretary General, for example, to make a statement about the women human rights defenders in Saudi Arabia. We do appreciate all the work of the mandate holders and the statements that have come from WHRD and Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, Michelle Forrest, and other special procedures. But we want to go right to the top with this appeal. So unless there's any burning issues, and I forgot something, I would just like to thank again the co-sponsors and organizers of the event, CIVICUS, most especially, and Linda, for all your amazing work, the United Nations Correspondents Association, Women's March Global, ISHR, Gulf Center for Human Rights, co-sponsors Urgent Action Fund, Scholars at Risk, and Global Fund for Women. Thank you so much. This is really essential to the work to try to help our women human rights defenders in prison in Saudi Arabia. So thank you, and thank you so much to the Saudi women on the panel, to Safa, Hala, Omaima, and Amani for participating.
Yeah, I'm very happy with all the
Thank
women
you.
from Saudi Arabia. Very much relieved that we did not stop because of what happened inside, but we've actually came together from different places, and we still continue to support those inside.
I'm the only jaded one in this group.
Thank you very much. Also, thank you very much to Cheryl for
Yes.
live streaming.
Yes. Everybody, if you could pick up on your way out the Gulf Center graphic novel, and also the report Treat Women Kindly, and then the postcard for the link to the petition. Every single person in this room, if you're in this room, you care about the issues that are happening in Saudi Arabia, sign the petition, please. Thank you.
Thank you.